I sat at the end of the table, my spoon halfway to my lips, when I realized my soup was cold. Not cool, not lukewarm, stone cold, like it had been waiting for me to humiliate myself. Around me, steam curled from every other bowl. Linda's smile from across the linen tablecloth wasn't the smile of a hostess caught in a mistake. It was the smile of someone delivering a message. Before we start the story, tell me where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe. The china clinked gently as porcelain bowls were set down around the long dining table, steam curling upward in soft, fragrant ribbons. Conversation buzzed over the floral centerpiece, hydrangeas and pale roses, perfectly symmetrical, as silver spoons dipped into the golden broth. Maggie Keene's spoon stopped halfway to her lips. Her soup was cold, not lukewarm, not cooled while we chatted. Cold enough to have been ladled an hour ago and forgotten in the refrigerator. Across the table, Linda Harrow's lips curled into a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh dear," she said lightly, tilting her head just so. "Must have been sitting too long in the kitchen." It was a performance. And like all of Linda's performances, the audience noticed. Several pairs of eyes darted toward Maggie, then away. The faintest shift in posture, a slight tightening around mouths, the collective, unspoken recognition of a social slight. Maggie returned the smile, her decades of event hosting poise holding firm. "It happens," she said, setting the spoon down without taking a bite. Linda turned her attention to the woman on her left, launching into a story about her latest trip to Napa, her hands moving gracefully over the gleam of her wine glass. Laughter bubbled from that side of the table, but it skirted around Maggie's end like water avoiding a stone. The fragrance of the hot soup wafted from her neighbor's bowls, roasted chicken, thyme, and a whisper of sherry. In front of her, the broth's surface was still as glass. The chill radiated upward, a cold breath against her face. She kept her back straight, her expression neutral. Inside, the memory clicked into place. Last month's luncheon, when Linda had made a pointed remark about some people never closing out their business accounts properly. A remark Maggie had ignored at the time. The failed investment. The money Linda still owed her. The debt Linda had apparently decided to repay in her own currency. Public embarrassment. Dessert came and went without incident. A delicate lemon tart, perfectly balanced between sweet and sharp. Maggie accepted hers, took one polite bite, and listened as Linda held court about her upcoming wine and cheese night, casually name-dropping a local food critic she'd just happened to invite. Every now and then, Maggie caught one of the guests glancing at her, measuring her reaction. Years in the world of high society events had taught her the rule. In these circles, losing composure was worse than losing money. She didn't give them the satisfaction. After coffee, coats were fetched, and air kisses exchanged in the foyer. Linda clasped Maggie's hand, her manicured nails cool against Maggie's skin. "Always lovely to have you, Maggie," she said. "We must catch up soon." "Oh, we will," Maggie replied, her tone light but carrying a weight only Linda could hear. The drive home was short, but the silence in Maggie's car felt cavernous. The streets of their upscale Minneapolis neighborhood were lined with maples just starting to turn for autumn, the gold leaves catching the low afternoon sun. Everything was crisp, clean, orderly, except for that bowl of cold soup in her mind. She parked in her driveway, letting the car idle for a moment before shutting it off. The hum of the engine faded, replaced by the distant sound of children playing 2 streets over. She sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and let the memory of Linda's smirk sharpen into clarity. Inside, her home was as she liked it. Polished wood floors, warm lamplight, fresh flowers in a crystal vase. She set her handbag down on the entryway table and walked straight to her study. The scent of paper and furniture polish met her as she opened the desk drawer. the one she hadn't touched in months. Her fingers brushed past old birthday cards, clipped articles, and neatly bundled tax returns until they found the thick folder labeled in her own handwriting looping script, Harrow Partnership Agreement. She drew it out, the weight of it settling in her hands like a well-balanced blade. At her desk, she flipped through the pages. Dates, signatures, repayment schedules, all there, all in black and white. The clause she remembered was still intact, still enforceable. The number owed sat at the bottom of the page, unshrinking despite the years. $85,000. She traced the ink with her fingertip, not in hesitation, but in confirmation. The cold soup had been a message. This would be her reply. That night, with the folder open in front of her, Maggie picked up her phone and scrolled to one name. Her voice was calm when Jody answered. "Hello, dear. I think it's time we talk about Linda Harrow." The study smelled faintly of lavender polish and old paper, the air still from years of careful order. Maggie pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she reserved for matters that weren't quite finished. The hinges groaned softly, a sound she found oddly satisfying, as if the drawer knew what was about to happen. Inside were stacks of manila folders, each labeled in her looping fountain pen script. She slid her fingers across the spines until they stopped on a name she hadn't said aloud in months, Harrow Partnership Agreement. She pulled it free, brushing away a faint trace of dust. It wasn't the dust of neglect, but of patience. Patience that had just run out. She carried the folder to her desk and flipped it open, the paper whispering against itself. The first page was the title sheet, bold black letters declaring the intent: a joint investment in a boutique catering venture. One Linda had accidentally sabotaged by overbooking herself with more glamorous social obligations. The venture had failed, but not before Linda had pocketed a significant portion of the startup funds. 5 years ago, the anger had been sharp and hot. Now it was cooler, more deliberate. The perfect temperature for action. She skimmed through the terms, the legal language steady and clear. There it was, 3/4 of the way down page 3. Repayment of principal within 60 months of dissolution, plus interest accruing annually. Maggie reached for a yellow highlighter from her pen cup, the cap snapping off with a quiet click. She drew a clean, unbroken line under the clause, the fluorescent color slicing across the page like a blade. Her lips pressed into a thin smile. Linda had 60 months. It had been 59. Maggie reached for her phone, scrolling to the contact she wanted. Jody Burns, her goddaughter, her favorite dinner companion, and more importantly, a damn good civil attorney. Jody picked up on the second ring. "Aunt Maggie? I was just thinking about you." "How quickly?" Maggie said, skipping all pleasantries. "Can we file a claim for breach of contract?" There was a pause, the sound of Jody shifting into professional mode. "That depends. What kind of breach? Partnership repayment? 5 years overdue. I have the agreement, the dissolution notice, and proof of funds transferred to her account." Another pause. Maggie could almost hear Jody's smile. "She's in breach. This will stick." The words settled in Maggie's chest like the first sip of a well-aged wine. Warm, certain, undeniable. "Good," she said simply. Jody's tone grew almost conspiratorial. "Do you want me to send over the intake forms, or should I just get this moving?" "Moving," Maggie said. "And Jody?" "Yes?" "We'll need a process server." "A good one." Jody chuckled softly. "Of course. We can serve her anywhere you want." Maggie looked down at the highlighted clause again, the yellow stripe glowing under her study lamp. Images of Linda's carefully curated luncheons and artful little jabs flickered through her mind. She thought of that smirk from earlier, the calculated placement of that ice-cold bowl. Linda thought she was playing a game of manners and appearances. Maggie was about to change the rules. Maggie leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing with precision. "Anywhere I want," she murmured into the quiet room. The corner of her mouth lifted as she already began picturing the perfect stage. Steam curled from the spout of Maggie's porcelain teapot, carrying the scent of Earl Grey through the sunlit kitchen. The table was set as if for royalty: linen napkins, delicate floral china, and a silver-tiered stand of shortbread and almond biscuits. It was a deliberate staging. Jody might be her goddaughter, but today, she was also her co-conspirator. Jody arrived with a brisk knock, dropping her leather satchel by the door. "You sounded energized last night," she said, slipping off her coat. Maggie poured her tea slowly, the amber liquid catching the morning light. "I've decided," she said, "that when I collect on what Linda owes me, it will be done with the same flair she uses to serve her petty little insults." Jody smirked. "So, not just filing papers in the mail then?" "Absolutely not." Maggie's voice had the steady calm of someone who'd been waiting years for this move. They talked logistics between sips, the clink of porcelain punctuating each idea. Jody's pen scratched across her notepad as Maggie explained that the timing mattered just as much as the debt itself. "Linda thrives on performance," Maggie said. "She chose her moment. Cold soup in front of half the neighborhood." "I'll choose mine." When Jody mentioned she'd overheard at the club that Linda was hosting a wine and cheese night next week, Maggie's eyes brightened. "High profile?" Jody nodded. "I heard she's invited that food critic from the Twin Cities Review." And the mayor's wife Maggie set her teacup down with a soft click. "Perfect." It took only a few minutes for them to settle on the plan. Jody would arrange for a process server. Not just any server, but one who could move discreetly until the exact moment. Maggie insisted the timing be after the second pour of wine. That's when she's most relaxed, her guard just a little down, but everyone's still engaged. "No one will miss it." Jody chuckled. "I'll make sure our guy understands the drama of the moment." After the plan was set, Maggie leaned back in her chair, her mind already moving to the next layer. Presentation. The outfit would have to say "I belong here" and "I'm untouchable" all at once. Something rich in color, tailored to perfection, but with a hint of steel in the accessories. She pictured the scene: guests mingling over Brie and Cabernet, Linda gliding from group to group with that rehearsed laugh, the sound of her own heels crossing the hardwood just before the hush fell over the room. "I want to see her face," Maggie murmured, almost to herself. "I want her to know, in that instant, exactly why this is happening." Jody's grin was wicked. "You know, Aunt Maggie, you might have missed your calling as a litigator." "Please," Maggie said with a faint smile. "Litigation is just dinner theater with more paperwork." When the tea was finished and the biscuits reduced to crumbs, Jody packed up her notes, promising to send Maggie the process server's profile by evening. Maggie walked her to the door, the air outside brisk with the first hints of Minneapolis autumn. Back in the kitchen, Maggie sat with her planner open, circling the date in red ink. She drafted a reply to Linda's invitation in her neat, deliberate script, "Delighted to attend. Looking forward to an unforgettable evening." She placed the card in an envelope, her fingers pressing the flap shut with care. As she walked to the mailbox, Maggie glanced at the reflection in her front window. A woman poised, patient, and already halfway to victory. She slipped the RSVP inside, her lips curling into a smile. The stage was officially set. The night air outside Linda Harrow's house was crisp, carrying the faint bite of early autumn. Maggie paused at the base of the front steps, adjusting the fall of her sapphire dress, silk that caught every flicker of the porch lantern and turned it into a whisper of light. A double strand of pearls rested at her collarbone, not the flashy kind, but the kind that said, "I have nothing to prove." From inside came the warm buzz of conversation, the clinking of wine glasses, and the low thrum of a string quartet piped in through hidden speakers. Maggie inhaled slowly. It smelled faintly of baked brie and fig jam, Linda's signature starter. She ascended the steps without hurry, her heels striking the wood with a rhythm that announced her long before she reached the door. The moment she stepped inside, heads turned. Maggie's presence was the kind that demanded acknowledgement, not by force, but by the quiet authority she carried in her posture. Her dress was a rich, deep blue, the exact shade that flattered her silver hair, and the cut skimmed her frame with a kind of elegance money alone couldn't buy. "Margaret," called Cynthia Walsh from across the foyer, breaking into a smile. "You look radiant." "Thank you, dear," Maggie replied, her voice warm but measured. She greeted each person with a gracious nod, noting who glanced her way twice and who quickly returned to their wine. Linda emerged from the dining room with a hostess's smile so polished it could have been lacquered on. She wore a red sheath dress and a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the chandelier light every time she lifted her hand, which she did often. "Maggie," she said, leaning in for an air kiss, "you made it." "Of course," Maggie replied, keeping her own smile soft, nonchalant. "Wouldn't miss it." Linda turned toward the bar cart and lifted a wine bottle. "Let me get you a glass. Special Reserve Cabernet. Just opened it for tonight." Her tone was laced with exaggerated generosity, like she was granting Maggie an honor. Maggie accepted the glass with steady fingers. How thoughtful. She let the deep aroma of blackberry and oak rise up before taking a small sip, her gaze never fully leaving Linda's face. If Linda sensed the undercurrent, she didn't show it. "Mingle, darling," she said, patting Maggie's arm before moving toward another group of guests. Maggie drifted into the living room, glass in hand, scanning the room with casual precision. She noted the food critic in a navy blazer, chatting with the mayor's wife near the charcuterie spread. A few of the neighborhood's most vocal gossips lingered by the fireplace, already eyeing Maggie's dress. The hum of the room was lively, warm, a perfect cover for what was about to happen. She positioned herself in a spot where she could see both the front door and Linda's trajectory through the party. Her phone, resting discreetly in her clutch, buzzed once. She slipped it open just far enough to read the screen. "Process server. In position." A slow, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips as she closed the clutch. She took another sip of her wine, letting the tannin settle on her tongue. The second pour wasn't far off. Across the room, Linda laughed too loudly at something the food critic said, her back turned toward the door. Maggie's fingers tightened slightly on her glass. In just a few minutes, the roles would shift. And everyone in this perfect little room would know it. The laughter in the room had a certain pitch to it, the kind that swelled and dipped like a well-rehearsed chorus. Linda was in her element, leaning in close to the food critic, head thrown back in a perfectly timed laugh. The sound carried over the clink of cutlery on appetizer plates, over the low hum of the music drifting from the speakers. Maggie let her wine glass hover just below her lips, watching the moment stretch. The process server stood at the edge of the crowd, blending in with the easy posture of a guest who belonged. He held a plain manila envelope in one hand, his other resting casually at his side. Their eyes met across the room for a fraction of a second, and Maggie gave the smallest nod, nothing more than the lowering of her lashes. Linda, oblivious, was telling a story about her recent trip to Napa Valley. "And then," she said, eyes sweeping the group, "the sommelier insisted we try this incredible ice wine." "Excuse me," the server said, stepping forward, his voice polite but firm. "Linda Harrow?" Linda turned, her smile already half-formed, the kind she reserved for photographers and unexpected praise. "Yes? You've been served." The words cut through the air sharper than crystal breaking. The envelope extended between them seemed to glow under the chandelier. Every guest's gaze pulled toward it as if by gravity. The string quartet's soft music felt suddenly too loud against the silence that fell over the group. Linda's hand hesitated, fingers fluttering like a trapped moth before she finally took the envelope. Maggie stayed exactly where she was, still holding her glass, her expression perfectly neutral. She could feel every eye in the room shifting, from Linda to the envelope to her, though she didn't meet anyone's gaze directly. Linda's laugh, the one she'd been mid-delivery, died halfway out of her throat. She swallowed hard. What is this? The process server gave a slight bow of his head, already stepping away. Have a good evening, ma'am. The sound of the envelope being torn open was louder than it should have been, paper giving way under sharp nails. A few guests tried to resume their conversations in hushed tones, but the attempt fell flat. No one was listening. Linda's eyes scanned the first page. Maggie watched the moment her smile collapsed. Not dramatically, but in the small, telltale ways. The corners of her mouth stiffened, her grip tightened. Her posture shifted half an inch backward, as though absorbing a blow. From Maggie's vantage point, she saw it clearly. The large, bold figure printed in the middle of the document, $85,000. Below it, the neatly indexed evidence list, each item a breadcrumb leading back to a debt Linda had thought safely buried. A guest near the door gasped. Another whispered something that ended with, "That much?" The gossip was already forming, knitting itself together in low, urgent threads. Linda's hand trembled slightly as she lowered the papers, eyes darting around the room in a rare break from her controlled composure. She looked at Maggie, just for a heartbeat, and in that fleeting glance was the dawning realization. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't going away. Linda's gaze fell back to the page, her lips parting as she read the first paragraph in full. The hush in the room deepened until the sound of her quickened breath was audible. Then, from somewhere to Maggie's left, a sharp inhale, followed by a whispered, "Oh my God." The summons wasn't just for the money, it came with a thick stack of evidence attached. Photographs, receipts, contracts, each one a nail in the coffin she hadn't even realized she'd climbed into. The room never fully recovered after the manila envelope landed in Linda's hands. Conversations resumed in patches, but they had a different texture now. Quieter, tighter, as though words were being measured for weight and consequence. Linda muttered something about stepping away for a moment and vanished toward the hallway, clutching the papers like they were leaking poison. Maggie stayed where she was for a beat, letting the absence settle before moving slowly through the room. She didn't hurry. She didn't oversmile. If anything, her composure seemed to draw people toward her, curious and cautious all at once. The soft jazz, once a pleasant hum in the background, now felt like a soundtrack to scandal. The first guest to sidle up was Marlene, all pearls and perfume, who leaned in under the pretense of admiring Maggie's bracelet. "That situation," she said, her tone feather-light but eyes sharp. "Is it serious?" Maggie's lips curved into a smile that gave away nothing. "Legal matters," she said, voice even, "are always serious." She let the sentence hang, the weight of ambiguity doing all the work. Word passed through the party like champagne bubbles, rising, popping, reforming in new corners. Phrases drifted to Maggie's ears. 85,000, can you imagine? She looked pale as a ghost. "I heard there were photographs." She didn't need to feed it. The story was already growing legs. She chatted with the caterer about the wine pairing, complimented a guest on her silk scarf. Each casual, ordinary gesture only seemed to make the contrast sharper, Maggie floating in calm while Linda's absence stretched longer and longer. By the time Maggie set her empty glass down and took her coat, she could feel the air thick with speculation. The next morning, the effect had spread beyond the house. At the corner cafe, two women in yoga gear paused mid-sip to watch her walk in. At the florist's, the clerk, who never remembered anyone's name, greeted her by it. Maggie knew, without asking, the story had already traveled the neighborhood, shrinking in accuracy but swelling in drama. By Monday, it was everywhere. The local book club just happened to bring it up. Her phone buzzed with texts from acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years, all framed as checking in. And Linda? Linda had quietly canceled 2 luncheons and postponed her next dinner party indefinitely. The queen of the social calendar had gone into hiding. It was mid-afternoon when Maggie's phone lit up with Jody's name. She answered in the sunny kitchen of her home, the smell of fresh coffee still in the air. "She's already reached out," Jody said without preamble. "Wants to talk settlement." Maggie leaned against the counter, letting the steam from her cup curl into the air. "That was fast," she murmured. "Fast," Jody replied, "and a little desperate." "Which means—" Maggie could hear the rustle of papers on the other end before Jody finished. "We can make the next move on our terms." Linda's offer arrived in Maggie's mailbox 2 days later, folded neatly in thick cream stationery that looked like it had been bought to impress. The envelope was scented. Something floral. Sharp. The kind of thing meant to soften a blow. Inside, the letter was typed in a formal, lawyerly tone, though Maggie could almost hear Linda's voice behind it. "Let's be reasonable." The number at the bottom made Maggie laugh out loud. $18,000. Not even a quarter of what was owed. Maggie set the letter down on her mahogany desk, smoothed the front of her cardigan, and reached for her phone. "Jody," she said when her goddaughter answered, "I think I've just received a comedy script in the mail." Jody didn't even need to see it. "She's testing the water." "That's not a settlement. That's an insult." They met later that afternoon at a little cafe with high-backed leather booths, the kind that muffled conversations. Maggie slid the letter across the table, careful not to crease it. "She's got no real defense," Jody said after scanning it. "Our documentation is airtight. We reject. Firmly. Keep it polite, but don't leave any opening for negotiation at that number." Maggie stirred her tea, letting the spoon clink softly against the cup. "I'll draft a reply tonight. In my own words." The reply went out the next morning. Short, crisp, with just enough courtesy to make it sting. "Dear Linda, thank you for your proposal. Unfortunately, the amount offered does not satisfy the outstanding debt, nor does it reflect the agreed terms of our partnership. I am confident we can resolve this in court if necessary. Respectfully, Margaret Keene." 2 days of silence followed, then 3. Then, a week in, the calls began. Not from Linda herself, but from a rotating carousel of mutual acquaintances. "Linda's going through a lot right now. She's worried about legal fees. Can't you just meet in the middle?" Maggie listened, nodded, and offered the same even-toned answer. "The terms were clear when we signed. I'm simply holding to them." When the court date notice arrived, 6 weeks out, it landed like a hammer on Linda's carefully curated life. Maggie imagined the conversation she must have had with her attorney, the rising panic as she realized the public would now be able to sit in on her humiliation. At the Saturday farmers market, Maggie caught sight of her across the street, standing stiffly by a stall of heirloom tomatoes. Their eyes met for a brief second. Maggie smiled. Linda didn't. The thing about confidence, Maggie knew, was that it didn't need to be loud. She wore hers like an accessory, understated, but visible to anyone who knew what to look for. And the more confident she appeared, the more rattled Linda became. Jody, ever the strategist, told her, "This isn't just about the case anymore. It's psychological. If she feels you're unshakable, she's more likely to fold before we even get to the courthouse." Maggie took that advice to heart. She went about her days as if the matter barely crossed her mind, hosting brunch, attending charity events, and showing up in outfits that suggested effortless composure. When people whispered about the summons situation, she smiled as though they were talking about the weather. Linda, meanwhile, was losing her grip on the image she'd spent years cultivating. The wine club announced a temporary pause on meetings. Her once busy driveway stayed empty most weekends. It was late on a Wednesday when the phone rang. Maggie answered, expecting Jody or perhaps her florist. Instead, it was their mutual friend, Celeste, the kind of woman who always sounded like she was delivering breaking news. "I thought you should know," Celeste said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "Linda's asking around. About you." Maggie leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Asking what, exactly?" Celeste hesitated. "She's digging for dirt, Maggie. She wants something she can use in court, or at least in the court of public opinion." Maggie's eyes drifted to the framed photograph on her mantel, the one taken at her retirement gala. A room full of people who knew her character inside and out. "If she's looking for dirt," Maggie said softly, "she's going to be disappointed." But as she hung up, her mind sharpened. Linda was cornered, and cornered people could be dangerous. The first whisper reached Maggie through the garden club. An acquaintance, cheeks pink with the effort of telling something she probably shouldn't, leaned close over the tulip bulbs and murmured, "Linda says you've had some financial troubles, that the court case is well, distraction." Maggie blinked once, slowly. "How imaginative of her," she said, straightening the seed packets on the table. "And how tiresome." By the end of the week, the rumor had sprouted in several corners of the neighborhood. At the bakery, the clerk asked if Maggie wanted to put her scones on account. At the wine shop, a regular tilted her head and asked if Maggie had been keeping busy lately. The tone was always the same, syrupy with pity, but laced with curiosity. Maggie didn't flinch. "My schedule," she would say lightly, "is as full as I like it." The thing about a lie, Maggie knew, was that it needs constant tending to survive, and Linda wasn't nearly careful enough to water hers without splashing mud on her own shoes. It didn't take long for Maggie's closest friends to begin pushing back. Marlene cornered her at the cafe one morning. "We asked our accountant to check. You're not in any kind of trouble, are you?" "No," Maggie replied with a calm that was almost bored. "And you're welcome to tell whoever you like that you've confirmed it." Linda, meanwhile, had begun to look frayed. At the post office, Maggie saw her struggling to keep up a bright tone with the clerk, eyes darting to anyone within earshot. At a mutual friends charity meeting, Linda offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the smile of someone counting her allies and realizing the math no longer favored her. Jody worked quietly in the background, filing motions and tightening the case like a drawstring bag. "The last thing she needs," Jody said one evening over the phone, "is to find a procedural gap to wriggle through. We'll give her nothing." Maggie, for her part, turned her attention to the upcoming court appearance. She selected a tailored charcoal suit and a pearl brooch, understated, but commanding. She met with Jody twice to rehearse her testimony. She even had her nails done in a soft blush, knowing how much the small details mattered in rooms where impressions lingered. If Linda's aim had been to rattle her, she had failed. Maggie's days remained a pleasant rhythm: breakfast at the kitchen table with the paper, errands through the sunny streets, dinners with friends who knew better than to believe in shadows conjured by a bitter woman. It was on a Thursday afternoon, as Maggie was arranging flowers in her front hall, that her phone buzzed. Jody's name appeared on the screen. "Linda's lawyer just called," Jody said without preamble. Maggie slid a lily into place. "And?" "They're requesting a closed-door mediation." Maggie paused, fingers brushing against the soft white petals. "Closed door?" she repeated. Jody's tone sharpened. "Yes, which tells me she's nervous about what will come out in open court." Maggie smiled to herself, the scent of fresh lilies filling the air. Then, she said, let's make sure she has every reason to be. The mediation room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the dry, recycled air of a place where people try to end fights without the spectacle of court. Linda had probably pictured it as a small, quiet affair, just her lawyer, and Maggie, where she could spin a softer version of events. Instead, when Maggie arrived, she was flanked by two impeccably dressed women from the local Chamber of Commerce, acquaintances she introduced as neutral observers for transparency. Both were pillars of the community, the sort whose word carried weight long after a meeting ended. Linda's eyes flickered just for a moment as she took in the extra chairs. I wasn't aware this would be public. It isn't, Maggie said smoothly, removing her gloves one finger at a time. But I like clarity when discussing serious matters. The observers smiled politely, pens poised above their notepads. The mediator began with the usual pleasantries, but Linda's lawyer jumped in quickly, tone light, almost casual. We believe there's a misunderstanding here. The figure Mrs. Keene is claiming is inflated, and my client maintains that the business arrangement in question was informal. Maggie leaned forward slightly. Informal? She reached into her leather portfolio and withdrew a neatly bound stack of papers. These are the signed partnership agreements. And these, she added, sliding a second folder across the table, are the bank records, investment transfers, and the correspondence confirming repayment terms. The room went quiet except for the sound of paper being shuffled. One of the observers looked directly at Linda. These appear very detailed, she said in a neutral tone that still managed to carry weight. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced at her lawyer, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Maggie didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The total, as per the agreement, is $85,000. I have given your client ample time to fulfill her obligation. We are now simply formalizing the inevitable. The mediator cleared his throat. Mrs. Harrow, do you have any documentation to dispute these records? Linda hesitated, fingers tightening on the edge of the table. Not at this moment. The observers kept writing. Their pens were quiet, but the weight of their presence was deafening. Jody, seated beside Maggie, leaned back and folded her arms, projecting the calm confidence of someone who knew the case was already won. Then, the mediator said slowly, it seems the path forward is straightforward. Mrs. Harrow will pay the full amount owed, with a payment deadline of 14 days. Maggie interrupted, her voice crisp. Linda's lawyer looked ready to protest, but a glance at his client's expression stopped him cold. The mediator nodded. 14 days. He began typing the settlement terms into his laptop. Linda sat stiffly, her jaw tight. She signed where she was told to sign, each stroke of the pen sounding louder than it should have. Maggie, however, was not done. One more condition, she said, her tone still calm but her eyes locked on Linda's. The mediator looked up. Yes? When payment is made, Maggie said, I will be free to publicly acknowledge that the debt has been resolved in full. Linda's head jerked up. Absolutely not. You've had ample opportunity for discretion, Maggie replied evenly. This is about closure, not embarrassment. My reputation was questioned. My friends were drawn into unnecessary speculation. The community deserves the truth. The observers didn't speak, but their pens kept moving. Linda's lawyer whispered something to her, but Maggie could see the calculation in Linda's eyes. There was no leverage left. She gave a tight nod. Fine. The mediator tapped the keys, adding the line to the agreement. Payment in full within 14 days, with public acknowledgement permitted by the recipient. Jody smiled faintly, leaning toward Maggie. Well played. Maggie signed her name with deliberate elegance, the ink drying in neat black lines. "I'm only playing by the rules," she murmured. As they left the building, Maggie paused in the doorway, sunlight spilling over her shoulder. She glanced back at Linda. "And now," she said, her voice just loud enough for the observers to hear, "we'll make it public." On Saturday morning, Maggie set her teacup down beside her laptop and logged into the Neighborhood Association's online group, a digital bulletin board where everything from lost cats to charity drives was posted. She typed slowly, deliberately, delighted to share that a long-standing financial matter has been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. "It's a relief to have closure, and I appreciate the support of friends who encouraged me along the way." Polite, gracious, entirely factual. She hit post. It took less than 10 minutes for the first comment to appear. "What financial matter?" "Carol from 3 streets over." Maggie replied simply, "The repayment of an investment debt by Linda Harrow." There. No adjectives, no embellishment. Just a clean statement of fact. And the name. By noon, the post had over 30 comments and a handful of private messages in Maggie's inbox. Some were supportive. "Good for you, Maggie." Others were tinged with curiosity. "I had no idea there was a dispute." What mattered was that the seed had been planted, and everyone knew exactly whose garden it had sprouted in. Across town, Linda was no doubt seeing the same thread spiral through her phone. Maggie could picture it. The tightening jaw, the frantic texting to allies, the dread of knowing the story was now free to walk on its own legs. By evening, Maggie's phone was buzzing with dinner invitations, brunch dates, and requests to attend charity events. "You must come to our wine tasting next week," one neighbor gushed over the phone. "And sit at my table. I want to hear the whole thing." Meanwhile, Linda's once-packed calendar was quietly emptying. The following Wednesday, Maggie overheard 2 women at the grocer's whispering near the Olive Bar. She canceled her garden tour. Probably doesn't want people talking. They're already talking. Maggie chose her olives in silence, a faint smile curving her lips. The beauty of the arrangement, she thought, was that she had never once said anything untrue or unkind. She had simply answered a question when asked. The rest, the speculation, the retelling, the social frost forming around Linda, was entirely self-inflicted. By Friday, a local charity organizer called Maggie to say they'd love to feature her at an upcoming gala. "It's so refreshing to see integrity rewarded," the woman said warmly. That evening, Maggie sat in her study, the glow from the table lamp soft against the walls. She poured herself a small glass of Pinot Noir and checked her mail. There, in a crisp white envelope, sat a cashier's check. The numbers were printed in bold type, the full $85,000. The memo line simply read, "Settlement." She turned it over once in her hand, feeling the weight of it. Payment was payment, whether it came with grace or gritted teeth. Maggie placed the envelope on her desk, reached for her phone, and dialed Jody. "It's here," she said simply. "Perfect," Jody replied. "Now, about that frame we discussed?" Maggie's smile widened. "Oh, I think it's time." The morning after the check arrived, Maggie walked into the bank as though she were delivering a crown jewel. The winter air outside was sharp, but inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and faintly citrus floor cleaner. She stepped to the counter, set her handbag neatly beside her, and slid the cashier's check toward the teller. "Deposit, please," she said with a serene smile. The teller's eyes widened slightly at the figure. "Certainly, Mrs. Keene." The stamp hit the paper with a crisp thunk, sealing the transaction in quiet finality. Back home, Maggie did not simply tuck the check's memory away into some folder. No, this victory was not to be filed. She made a copy on her high-resolution printer, the ink settling into the paper in sharp, perfect lines. Beneath the bold number and the word settlement, she added a small engraved brass plaque to be mounted on the bottom, paid in full. She found a mahogany frame, understated, elegant, and placed the photocopy inside. The glass gleamed as she hung it in her study, just to the right of her writing desk, where the morning light caught it perfectly. The first guest to notice was Marlene, dropping by with a bouquet of hydrangeas. Her eyes flicked to the frame. "What's this?" she asked, stepping closer. Maggie didn't answer immediately. She poured tea into delicate china cups, let the steam curl between them, then began. "Do you remember Linda's wine and cheese night?" Marlene's lips parted. "Oh, that night." Maggie told the story with the kind of pacing that would have made her late husband, a man who appreciated a well-timed punchline, proud. She laid out the cold soup, the years-old debt, the public serving of the summons. Her voice was even, her words chosen with precision, letting Marlene connect the dots herself. By the time she finished, Marlene was laughing so hard she had to set her teacup down. "You framed it?" she gasped. "Of course," Maggie said, sipping calmly. "It's art. It's history." Over the next 2 weeks, more guests came and went. Book club members, bridge partners, a few of the women from the charity committee. Every one of them eventually found their eyes drifting toward the frame. Maggie never pointed it out. She simply let curiosity pull them toward it, and when they asked, she told the story again. Always with the same balance of restraint and detail, never adding more than necessary, never making it sound like gloating. Though, of course, it was. Laughter replaced the old tension. The same women who had once nervously avoided speaking about the tension between Maggie and Linda now delighted in the retelling, their chuckles carrying long after they left. Maggie noticed a subtle shift in the air, a shared understanding that she was not someone to be trifled with. And Linda? She avoided the topic entirely. At the grocery store, she would nod politely, exchange the most clipped of pleasantries, and move on quickly, as though afraid the story might somehow surface mid-sentence. The silence from her was as satisfying as the check itself. One evening, as Maggie sat in her study with the fire crackling and the frame glinting in the lamplight, Jody stopped by. She walked over to the desk, studied the display for a moment, and smirked. "You know," Jody said, settling into an armchair, "there's still one thing you haven't done." Maggie arched an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Jody leaned forward. "Interest. Legally, you're entitled to it. All those years she held on to your money? It adds up." Maggie let the idea settle, a slow smile forming. "You think it's worth the trouble?" Jody's grin was wicked. "Worth it?" "Maggie, it'll be the encore." Maggie swirled the wine in her glass, the ruby liquid catching the firelight. "Then," she said softly, "let's begin." Jody's words lingered in the warm air of Maggie's study long after she left. Interest. Maggie had been savoring her victory like a well-aged Bordeaux, and now Jody had uncorked another bottle entirely. By morning, Maggie was seated at her desk with a fresh pot of Earl Grey, the scent of bergamot drifting through the room as she read through the legal notes Jody had sent overnight. The numbers were neat, deliberate, undeniable. Linda hadn't just owed the principal. She owed for the years she'd treated that debt like her personal loan from Maggie's kindness. Maggie smiled to herself. Time to collect on the delay. Jody moved fast. Within 48 hours, she had filed the paperwork. The language in the motion was precise and cool, devoid of any personal sting, but the intent was razor-sharp. Maggie imagined Linda's face when the envelope arrived. It didn't take long. 3 days later, Maggie was at the florist's counter choosing pale pink peonies when her phone buzzed. A text from Jody. "She's been served." Again. Maggie chuckled, selecting an extra bouquet just for herself. Linda's reaction rippled through the neighborhood almost instantly. At the Thursday Bridge Club, A mutual acquaintance leaned across the table, voice lowered but eyes alight. Apparently, she's livid. But there's nothing she can do. It's airtight. Maggie kept her gaze on her cards. It's just business, she said lightly, discarding a heart. The truth was, she could practically hear the sound of Linda pacing in her perfectly staged kitchen, the fury bubbling under that hostess smile she wore like armor. Powerless fury was its own kind of justice. Rather than watch it unfold from the sidelines, Maggie decided to enjoy herself. She booked a full spa day at the most exclusive retreat in the city. Eucalyptus steam rooms, hot stone massage, cucumber water served in frosted glasses. She spent hours wrapped in plush white towels, her phone turned off, her mind blissfully uncluttered. When the massage therapist worked a stubborn knot from her shoulder, Maggie thought, "This is what winning feels like." The following Saturday, her closest friends gathered for an intimate dinner at her condo. They toasted with crisp champagne, the bubbles catching the lamplight as they clinked glasses. "To collecting all that's owed," Jody said, with a knowing grin. Maggie raised her glass. "And to patience, which, as it turns out, has a monetary value." Laughter rolled around the table, light and unhurried. By the time dessert, a perfectly warm apple tart, was served, Maggie's phone vibrated against the table. One glance at the screen and her lips curved. The bank notification was unmistakable. A second payment, this one sweeter than the first, had just landed in her account. Maggie slid the phone back into her purse without a word, letting the satisfaction settle in her chest like the last sip of good wine. The encore had been played, and she was already thinking about the curtain call. The envelope looked too formal to be casual, too personal to be junk. Thick, cream-colored cardstock, her name written in Linda's elegant looping script. The kind you see on wedding invitations or charity galas. Maggie set it on the counter, stared at it for a moment, then slid a butter knife under the flap. Inside, an intimate dinner with friends. Saturday evening, 7 p.m. The note ended without flourish. No apology, no explanation. Just a time, a date, and Linda's name in black ink. The audacity made Maggie laugh, low and quiet. Months of lawsuits, settlement checks, and neighborhood whispers. And now an invitation to sit at Linda's table? Was it a peace offering or one last stage for Linda to reclaim control? Either way, Maggie knew she would go. She wanted to see how Linda planned to play her hand. Saturday evening, Maggie arrived in a charcoal silk blouse and tailored black slacks. Understated elegance. She parked a block away, preferring the short walk to clear her head. The air was cool, the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke drifting around her. Linda's front door swung open before she could knock. "Maggie," Linda said, smiling too tightly. "So glad you could make it." Maggie stepped inside. The dining table glimmered under soft candlelight, set for 10 with fine china, crystal goblets, and freshly polished silver. The air was rich with the smell of roasted duck, rosemary, and garlic. Guests, all familiar faces from countless neighborhood functions, greeted her warmly, their tones carefully neutral. The tension was unspoken but present, coiled in the air like the faint hum of static before a storm. Linda moved from guest to guest, glass of wine in hand, her hostess smile painted on. She avoided direct eye contact with Maggie, though her voice carried just enough when offering wine. "Would you like red or white?" "White, thank you," Maggie replied, tone as smooth as the silk on her shoulders. Conversation over the hors d'oeuvres was light. Vacations, the recent charity auction, the weather. But under the surface, Maggie could feel the glances. People were curious. They remembered the summons. When dinner began, the first course arrived. Steaming bowls of creamy bisque, each one sending up gentle tendrils of aromatic heat. Maggie noticed hers was no different from the others. She lifted the spoon deliberately, letting the steam curl toward her face before taking a slow sip. It was perfect. Piping hot. Linda's eyes flicked toward her, just for a second, as if to confirm Maggie had noticed the contrast to their last soup encounter. Maggie smiled slightly and set her spoon down, the quiet acknowledgement hanging between them like an inside joke neither could laugh at. The rest of the meal passed in careful civility. Linda kept conversation general and brief, her gaze sliding past Maggie as if she were just another guest. But Maggie could feel the weight of the evening's subtext pressing into every polite exchange. When dessert was announced, a rich chocolate torte, Maggie declined. She had no intention of lingering any longer than necessary. "Thank you, Linda," she said as she stood. "It was a lovely evening." Linda's smile tightened by a millimeter. "Safe drive home." Outside, the October air felt sharper, cleaner. Maggie opened her handbag and pulled out a small ivory envelope she had prepared earlier that day. Inside was a neatly penned thank you card that read, "Thank you for the evening." The meal was unforgettable. Between the folds of the card was a photocopy of the cashier's check Linda had given her. The full settlement for the $85,000 debt. She walked back to Linda's house under the halo of the street lamps, her heels clicking against the pavement in steady rhythm. Without knocking, she slipped the envelope into the brass mailbox slot by the door, the faint metallic clink punctuating her departure. By the time Linda found it, the candles would be burned down, the guests gone, and in her hand would be a permanent reminder, crisp, undeniable, that Maggie had not only been paid, but had been served the final course of this game on her own doorstep. There was a time when walking into the local market meant Maggie could hear the whispers trail behind her. "That's her," someone would murmur, and a pair of eyes would dart away the moment she turned. But now, weeks after Linda's dinner invitation and the thank you card with its sharp-edged message, the tone had shifted. The whispers had faded, replaced with nods of acknowledgement and the occasional warm smile. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was respect. Maggie could feel it in the way people leaned in to speak to her, the way conversations paused politely when she entered a room, as though her presence deserved a little more air. Linda, for her part, had adapted. At community events, she now greeted Maggie with the same polite, clipped warmth she gave everyone else. No lingering jabs, no subtle digs. Their encounters were smooth, neutral, and completely on Maggie's terms. When Maggie decided to host her own autumn garden brunch, the RSVPs poured in. Every seat at the long linen-draped table filled quickly. On the morning of the event, she arranged the final touches herself. Fresh hydrangeas in low crystal vases, platters of smoked salmon and croissants, and champagne chilling in silver buckets that caught the early sunlight. The weather cooperated beautifully. A crisp but sunny day, with a light breeze carrying the scent of baked cinnamon scones from the kitchen. As guests arrived, Maggie noticed the same recurring expression, a brief pause at her front step, a smile tugging at their lips, and then the inevitable mention. "So, Maggie, is this the same table where you wrote the letter?" Or, "I still can't believe the look on Linda's face when she got served." She never encouraged the conversation, but she never shut it down either. A knowing smile was enough. By early afternoon, her backyard hummed with comfortable chatter and laughter. The air clinked with the sound of champagne flutes, and every now and then she caught someone glancing toward the study. The one room in her house she never failed to leave slightly ajar. Inside, in perfect view from the doorway, hung the framed photocopy of Linda's settlement check. It wasn't gaudy or oversized, but it was unmistakable. People would wander past just to use the bathroom and come back with the faintest smirk, as if they'd stumbled upon a well-placed painting in a private gallery. Jody arrived a little after noon, still in her tailored blazer from an early client meeting. She found Maggie near the patio's edge, watching guests laugh over the dessert table. "That's the last of it," Jody said softly, handing her a slim folder. "The court file's officially closed. Debt paid in full, interest satisfied, everything airtight." Maggie accepted the folder but didn't open it. "Feels strange," she admitted. "Like putting a very expensive book back on the shelf." Jody chuckled. "One you wrote yourself." Later, after the last guest had gone and the empty champagne bottles had been tucked into the recycling bin, Maggie walked into her study. She placed Jody's folder on the desk, right beside the framed check. For a moment, she just stood there, fingertips resting lightly on the glass frame, feeling the cool smoothness beneath her hand. That check wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the control. The reminder that she had set the terms and Linda had played by them. The following week, Maggie was pruning the last of the season's roses in her front garden when a small moving van pulled up across the street. A new neighbor, mid-30s, hair tied back in a loose ponytail, stepped out and waved. By late afternoon, the woman walked over with a plate of still warm chocolate chip cookies. "I'm Emily," she said brightly. "Thought I'd introduce myself. I've already heard you're the person to talk to when you need advice." Maggie smiled, brushing soil from her gloves. "Advice about what?" Emily hesitated, biting her lip. "Well, about how to make someone pay what they owe you." Maggie felt the corner of her mouth lift into a slow, measured smile. "Why don't you come in for tea?" she said. "I might have a story or two." Some people mark the turning points in their lives by birthdays, weddings, or funerals. Maggie marked hers by a spoon, one that had paused mid-air over a bowl of chilled soup on a winter afternoon. A small moment, petty on the surface, but enough to tilt the axis of a decades-old social balance. It was funny now, in the way lightning is funny after the storm has passed. She could remember every detail, the exact shade of the porcelain bowl, the faint frost clinging to the soup's surface, the perfectly arched brow on Linda's face when she'd said, "Oh dear, must have been sitting too long." It had been the moment Maggie decided that some slights were worth answering, and she had answered. Thoroughly. Her kitchen was warm this evening, lit by the soft glow of pendant lamps. Aromas of roasting garlic and fresh herbs filled the air as she stirred a pot on the stove. Hot soup, of course. The garden brunch had been a success, and now she was preparing a smaller, more intimate dinner for the friends who had stood by her through the whole affair. The check still hung in her study, though it no longer felt like a trophy. Now it was simply part of the decor, like the antique clock on the mantel or the silver-framed photograph of her and her late husband on their wedding day. It wasn't about the reminder anymore. It was about the shift it had cemented. Friendships had rearranged themselves quietly but decisively in her favor. Invitations that once felt obligatory now came with genuine warmth. Neighbors who had kept a careful social balance between her and Linda no longer bothered. They chose sides, and their choice was clear in the way they showed up for Maggie's events and politely declined Linda's. By the time Jody arrived, the dining table was already set, crisp white linen, crystal glasses, and china that caught the light. Jody slipped out of her coat and gave the pot on the stove an exaggerated sniff. "Please tell me that's exactly what I think it is," she said. Maggie ladled a small taste into a porcelain cup and handed it over. "Piping hot." Naturally, Jody sipped and closed her eyes. "Perfect. You could build a business on this." Then, with a mischievous grin, "You know, we could actually do that. Revenge catering. Meals tailored to personal vendettas. Cold appetizers for the recently slighted, over-seasoned entrees for the passive-aggressive, and, of course, hot soup for the victorious." Maggie laughed, a genuine, full laugh that warmed her chest as much as the steam from the pot. "I'd need you as head of legal, of course." "Obviously," Jody said, raising her glass in an informal toast. The dinner flowed easily. Conversation meandered from travel plans to books they were reading, to a recent scandal involving someone 3 streets over who had been caught plagiarizing recipes for the community cookbook. Maggie found herself listening more than talking, content in the simple rhythm of clinking cutlery and murmured laughter. At one point, her gaze wandered to the window, where the faint reflection of the room glimmered against the dark glass. She realized that this, the warmth, the control, the chosen company, was the real victory. The cold soup, the summons, the settlement. They had been steps on the way to reclaiming a space she had nearly surrendered without noticing. After the last course had been cleared, Maggie poured herself a final glass of wine and sat back in her chair. Jody was still talking animatedly about her revenge catering idea, but Maggie only half listened now, her mind drifting in that comfortable space between reflection and amusement. Yes, small moments could change everything, but only if you were willing to seize them, polish them, and serve them back in the exact way you chose. She lifted the glass to her lips, savoring the deep, velvety wine. And I always serve it hot,